Hello everyone, welcome today to silicone mold making and liquid plastic castings. My name is Eric Barnes. I am a props master here in St. Louis. And for those of you that have never been to one of my workshops before or seen these things before, today what we're going to be talking about is the creation of silicone molds and then casting into them plastic copies using a two-part liquid plastic. The reason that I really like this area for props making is because it allows me to either augment or replicate a prop that I didn't feel safe on stage or couldn't use on something on stage in its original form. One of the best examples of this is something like this brooch. This brooch is an antique piece of mine, and it's a really beautiful little piece, but I wouldn't want to use it on stage because I wouldn't trust how it might need to be treated in a show. So for example, if it needs to be thrown or needs to be like knocked off or, broken in half, I wouldn't want to do that with an actual vintage piece. What I can do instead is basically make a silicone mold and then create a plastic copy. These are two different versions I did just in different colors to kind of give you a sense on screen of the difference. But I could theoretically match to whatever I needed them to look like. And so this is what I call the multiplication reason for using, because I have something that I could use, but I don't want to use it, and so I need to make a multiple of it to use it on stage. There's another sort of version of this, which is the safety reason, right? So this is a glass elephant that I molded and cast for a show that I was working on, and it needed to be thrown. And so for safety reasons, I obviously didn't want to throw the real glass one so that I wouldn't have to worry about having many copies of it. This is actually made out of a super rigid, flexible, clear rubber. And so that allowed me to have the same sort of look of the real piece, but in a much safer version. I do this a lot with glassware too. And this again is for safety reasons, right? This needed to be thrown for a show. And you can see in this case, it's a softer version. And so what that allows me to do is allows me to have something that looks right on stage, but isn't going to harm anyone off stage or on stage when that prop is used as the director has asked for it to be. And then there's one other kind of generalized category of why I might make a prop, and that is if the original item needs to look different. So let's go back to our elephant friend right here. This was cast out of a clear glass elephant, but let's say, for example, maybe the director wanted something that looked different. By using different tricks and techniques, I can make the same positive, the same object, but with a different finish or treatment. And it allows me to create the look that the designer or the director are after for my show. So before we get into the hows of making objects with these things, there's some terminology we need to kind of talk about first. And the first one is fairly easy. It's the idea of a mold and then a casting. So in this case, this right here is a mold. It typically has an open space in it that you'll pour your casting into, creating whatever you're after, right? So, in general, the terminology that I will use is positive is whatever the original is. So in this case with our brooch, this here would be our positive. I would then pour liquid silicone over it to make the mold. And then I could pour liquid plastic or another material into it to make a casting. So in terms of silicone mold making, there are three general ways of which you can apply the silicone. The most common one that I will use is what's called the pour over method. And this is a sort of mock-up of that. And you can see here in the bottom I've got a positive, and then I have something to sort of hold the silicone in this case a little Dixie cup that I've glued to this. And then I pour over the silicone. That's the mold method we're going to be talking about later today, and I'm going to be demoing in more detail. There are two other ones. The other one I use a lot for like quick props is this. This is called mold putty. And instead of pouring over a thinner viscosity silicone, this one you use a thicker version of silicone, and you treat it sort of like the way we treated silly putty when I was growing up. You mix it together, knead it, and then press it into an object, and that will create sort of a freestanding mold. The advantage of the pour over is that because it is typically a thinner silicone, it captures better detail, and but the downside is you have to have something to kind of contain it. This one also tends to harden fairly quickly because of its format. Those putties tend to give you a fairly quick, fairly fast mold, but the detail is lacking because either you can catch a lot of air bubbles into the surface, or just because it isn't quite as detailed, able to capture quite the same detail that a pour-over silicone would. There is a third kind of application of silicone as well, which I use a lot for bigger projects, and that's what's called the brush-on. And so in this case, this is a brush-on mold. In the same way with our liquid silicone, it's a two-part, and then you have to brush on thin levels of it. And what that does is it saves you a lot of silicone, but the downside of it is that it takes a long time, because I've got to wait for each level of the silicone to cure before I can put the next one on. The other thing that it requires is it requires some sort of support shell, because this is basically just a big balloon. And so you can imagine if I went to pour something into it without some sort of structure to hold it in the right shape, my casting would be morphed out of shape. And so in this case, I have a sort of foam piece that this sets inside of to cast. To give you guys kind of a sense of the difference, these are both that elephant mold I showed you earlier. This is our little brush-on version. See? And so that's the amount of silicone required to make him. And then this is the same mold with a block format. So I wouldn't need a shell for this, but obviously you can see it took a lot more silicone to make. And sometimes, depending on what the casting is, it can be harder or easier to demold from a block mold. In this case, because of the trunk, you kind of have to wiggle it out a little bit more, so this one's actually easier to demold from. But the same casting, just obviously this is just a different color. That kind of gives you a sense of those. To be honest, I wouldn't often use a brush mold on something this small, but this is really helpful for doing big things like statues or things you can imagine. If I'm trying to do a 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot tall bust as a positive, trying to make a solid block mold out of that would just be entirely impractical, and so you kind of really do have to use some sort of brush-on method. No matter whether you're working with a pour-over silicone, a brush-on silicone, or a putty silicone, there is one other very important element that you need to think about when you're creating your castings and your mold making. And that is what kind of silicone. There are basically two major types. The first of which is what's called tin cure, and the second of which is called platinum cure. And effectively, it's just the structure of what the catalyst is of the silicone, is the difference between the two, one with tin and one with platinum. As I'm sure any of you that know anything about metals knows, platinum is more expensive than tin, so it is more expensive a silicone. There are advantages, though, to the platinum cure, which is that it tends to have a better elasticity, and I find that it has a lot better shelf life. So I can keep a mold that's made out of platinum-based silicone for a lot longer. These are molds of the exact same thing. In this case, it's like a little mini muffin. Now, these molds were made about 8 years ago, and so they both have seen a little bit better days. But this one here is made out of a tin cure silicone called Umu, and this one here is made out of a platinum silicone Moldstar 16. And you can see even on the bottom, this has a lot smoother surface. It tends to fill in the gaps a little more. This one kind of tends to be a little more porous and have kind of some pockets. So this tends to have a lot, I find, of imperfection in the surface. With a thing like a mini muffin or any food product, that's not really a problem because you don't really care about those little air bubbles. But if you're doing something detailed like a coin mold or something like this guy, it could be really important to what your final product is. And especially if you're doing things like glass, if you're trying to make a smooth casting, I find that the best results come from this because it has a more solid surface, and so it gives a better glass texture. So the platinum cure silicones, especially this Moldstar 16, have a lot of flexibility to them, and as you can see, they really kind of are able to spring back to their original form fairly well. As opposed to Umu or most tin silicones, which don't have quite the same elasticity and structure, you can see this one, as I'm trying to spread it out to get the thing out, starts to kind of crack. So in that case, I need to use it with a rubber band to kind of hold it back together. And at some point, it will just crack entirely because its structure is more fragile. This is a mold I made for one of my friends. Her kid wanted to make a sort of toad action figure friend, froggy action figure. And you can see because of the shape trying to get this out, we had to go ahead and break the mold entirely to get it out. And that's just one of the potential downsides of using a tin cure silicone, is that it doesn't have the same stretchability as platinum does. The other place where platinum versus tin really matters is if you are casting something in either platinum or tin. And what I mean by that is, obviously with our liquid plastics, both will release just fine from any of the silicone molds. And so in that case, we don't need to worry about it. But if I want to make a positive, if I want my either starting thing to be a silicone mold already, or silicone positive, or I'm trying to make a casting out of silicone, I need to make sure that my varieties match. So, for example, I wanted to make a platinum cure silicone chicken breast, and I was using a product called Dragon Skin as my finished product. And so in order to use this platinum cure silicone, I had to make sure that my mold was also a platinum cure silicone. Because if my mold had been tin cure, this surface would never have actually set up. And vice versa. If for some reason I wanted to use a tin cure silicone as my final casting material, I would need to make sure that the mold that I was casting into was also the same type. And I would still need to use a lot of mold release from this, because the only thing that silicone bonds to is itself. And so that's why it's great for liquid plastic castings or plaster castings, because you don't normally need a mold release. But obviously if I'm pouring a giant chunk of silicone into another chunk of silicone, I need to make sure it releases or I'll end up with one just solid block of silicone. So once you've decided what type of mold you want to make, whether you want to do a putty mold, a brush-on mold, or a pour-over mold, and then once you've decided if you want to use a tin cure silicone or a platinum cure silicone, there is one other detail that you need to think about in terms of what kind of silicone to get. And it is two terms, and they're always listed on the bottle. In this case, I'm using a bottle of Rebound 25 to show you. The first is pot life. So in this case, for the Rebound that's in here, which is not the silicone we're going to use today, the pot life is 20 minutes, and the cure time is 6 hours. And so what those two words mean, pot life is the amount of time that you have to mix up your silicone before it becomes basically too thick to use or pour over, and you might lose detail or have other issues with the use of that silicone. And then demold time or cure time is the amount of time it takes for the product to fully set up. We're going to use for this class Moldstar 16, and it's two parts. One part in a sort of white color and one part in a kind of blue color. And when mixed up, that will give us this color that you've seen most of my molds made out of. I use Moldstar 16 for basically almost any generalized mold I make, because I find it to be the fastest to set up, which is great for theater and especially at like high school level to get things done quickly after school. But also I find that it has a shelf life that is worth the investment in the mold, and so it kind of is the best of both worlds for me. It's got about a 6-minute pot life and about a 30 to 45 minute demold time. So I'm going to start this by actually unmolding this other one. The silicone in here, this pink silicone, is actually a food safe silicone that I will talk about more in my food class. But that is one other thing that you can do with silicone, is make food safe silicones to make either candies or chocolates or things like that. And it works exactly the same. The products are basically function exactly the same. It's just you need to get one that is rated to be food safe. You can see, in that case, I've got a little mold friend. So this is the positive we're working with today. This is a little coin that I sculpted. And one of the things you always want to think about when you are starting your mold making process is that no matter how heavy you think this item is, you're going to want to attach it temporarily to whatever container you're using. So in this case, because this is clay and my container is plastic, I'm just going to go ahead and put a small bead of hot glue around the back. And then center him in the cup. And then for the purpose of this demo, I have our little cup here, but I'm then going to go ahead and put another bead of hot glue just to sort of seal this down. Now I'm using 2 clear containers today here just to kind of give you a sense of things. Kind of give you a little bit better visual. To be honest with you, most of what I use when I'm making off-the-shelf molds or quick grab-and-go molds are some sort of like pre-made container. I use a lot of these little Pringles cans. I use a lot of Dixie cups. You can see this is a mold where I glued the positive into a little Dixie cup and then pour it in there. If I am doing something bigger, I will make sometimes mold boxes, and I can do that either by using pieces of plexiglass or cardboard that I wrapped in clear packing tape to give me a smooth surface. Basically what I want to do is I want to make sure that whatever container I'm using as my mold holder is something that I will not care about if I need to cut it out to get the mold out, and also something that is strong enough to be able to hold the liquid until it cures. So we're now ready to make a mold. As I said, I've already measured out the 2 parts of my silicone, in this case part A and part B. This silicone works as a 1-to-1 by volume, and so I was able to measure out. A lot of people, when they're not used to getting started with silicone, always ask me why I'm not using like a measuring cup or using like measuring spoons or something to measure it out. All measurements like that, all cups, all teaspoons, all tablespoons, are basically a version of volume. And so by doing 2 of the same identical container, in this case these little 1-ounce plastic cups filled to the same point, I've actually created a more equal volume to make sure that I have the right amount of each product. Also, you'll notice I'm going to use 2 different mixing cups. The reason for that is that I want to make sure I like to use 2 mixing cups when doing this so that I make sure that I get all of the product evenly incorporated. I don't want to have any little unmixed portions go into my final mold, because in that case I could ruin the mold. And the expense of the extra plastic cup is nowhere near the expense of the silicone. So you can see I'm just mixing these 2 silicones now to try and get a homogeneous color. I want to make sure that I'm scraping down the sides and scraping the bottom, but I'm trying to kind of not add too much air. I'm trying to kind of move through rather than whipping it up. And if I do find air, I try and kind of pop the bubbles a bit. And then this is also why I like the second cup, because then it allows me to kind of decant it and kind of try and pop any of those big bubbles by pouring slowly into our second cup. And again, you can kind of see the unmixed portions in that cup. I'm just going to kind of, once again, make sure I've got everything evenly mixed in here. And then in terms of pouring, I like to pour in sort of a thin, even stream over the positive to make sure that I don't get any air bubbles trapped on the surface. And I like to kind of let it kind of flow out and force the air bubbles up and out as it goes. And you can see those air bubbles kind of popping out as they kind of The big advantage of using clear containers is it lets me know when I've kind of filled enough to have a decent mold structure. And then I like to tap a little bit. This again just kind of helps release any small surface bubbles on this, that are caught in that texture on top, and allows them to float up. So now that we have our molds made, it's time to cast something into them. And we're going to start off today with Smooth Cast 300Q. This is the fastest setting plastic that they make. It is not my recommendation if you're just getting started out with this, but it's easier for this demo to kind of show you all the processes kind of collapsed in time. So again, as we talked about with pot life and demold time, this is the rushed version to kind of show you on film. And if you're going to start out with this at your schools or for your hobbies, I'd recommend starting with something that has a slower cure phase. So again, much like our silicones, this is 1:1 by volume, part A, and part B I've already measured out. They come in the same sort of pint kits or gallon kits, depending on what size you want to work with and the volume you're going to need for your project. And again, in exactly the same way as our silicones are mixed, we're going to mix in the 2-cup mix method, especially with this, to make sure that we have everything evenly incorporated and that we have no unmixed product, because that will really mess up the liquid plastic. So what's happening is that these two parts are coming together, and when they come together they have an exothermic reaction, which for those of you from science class remember, that means basically that heat is produced as part of the reaction. And so what's going to happen is that this is going to get super, super hot, and in that time a bunch of tiny little air bubbles are going to be captured in the plastic, so it's going to go from being this clear that you see in front of us now to being an opaque milky white color. So you can see, even in my cup, how it's solidified in mid-pour. And so all this area that's already milky white now is solid. So this is what's called the flash cure. Which means that instantaneously, basically, it goes from being a liquid to being a solid. Now you can see kind of around the edges where it's still clear. Because this is an exothermic reaction, it's going to start at the center of mass and kind of work its way out. And so the edges will be the last thing that cast. It's especially important to remember that when you're working on things like the elephant, or things that have perhaps a portion of them that are farther away from the center of mass, because it might be that the base is very solid, but it hasn't reached all the way to the end of the trunk. And so what you don't want to have is you don't have to pull it out too early and have that become deformed because that hasn't quite cured yet. And this is our coin mold. Now this is not entirely cured. I should wait longer to pull it out. But one of the things I did want to show you is that it is possible at these moments to kind of flex it. So one thing that I'll do with this technique a lot is make medallions or castings that need to get mounted onto a pole or a column or something. Because then if I have a copy of it, I can bend it to the curvature that I need and let it cure that way. And I get the detail I want, but able to be attached to a pole or a column or a stair or something like that. So it's kind of a cool effect that you can do with these. So the clear plastic looks the same. These are now the clear plastics that I've portioned out. Again, this is Smooth Cast 325. And you can leave it like this and it kind of becomes like slightly amber clear. Or in this case, I'm going to tint it with 1 drop of blue. This is a pigment that's specifically made by the same company, and you can see how dark that single drop of color makes this liquid. These are the dyes that are specifically made by them. You want to make sure that you always use a resin dye. You don't want to use food dye or anything like that because it has too much water in it, and that water, when this exothermic reaction happens, will boil out and you'll be left with poor results. So, again, I'm going to put this portion in. You always want to make sure that you add the colorant to one of the parts. It's especially important with these kind of plastics that have a short pot life. You can imagine if I've only got 30 seconds, like with that plastic we just used, I don't want to waste any of my time mixing in the color. And so that's why I always mix the color into one part first, because that way I know that it's evenly incorporated and I'm not waiting on the wasting any of my time in that mixing process. So people always ask me what I do with the extra because it can't really be saved. That's why I have all these little tiny molds sitting around my workspace. Because if I do have extra that I've mixed up, I always try and pour them into something to get some sort of positive thing out. And then I have them around my workspace at school, and I will give them to the students as Barnes Awards, they call them. So, as we saw with the opaque white plastic, that went through what's called the flash cure, and so it meant that instantaneously it went from being a liquid to being a solid. If this plastic did the same thing, it would become opaque, and so what this goes through is called the gel cure phase. And so as the chemical reaction starts happening, it's thicker and thicker. And as we'll watch, this will kind of start thickening up. So as this goes through, it's transition from its pot life into the finished casting. This is where the pot life kind of really becomes a problem. You can see how thick this is now. If I was going to try and pour this at this point into a mold, I'd very well maybe have imperfections or have air bubbles trapped in it because it's just too viscous now to get a good result. So that's the post pot life, but before I can demold it. While we wait for our clears to be able to be pulled out of their mold, to kind of give you a sense of the same volume of dye in the white opaque plastic, I'm going to do the same thing, but with just a single drop of the blue in that opaque plastic to show you the difference in color that you'll get. You can see now that our clears and our opaque look the same at this stage, but once that flash cure happens here as it goes in the center working its way out, you can see it has a very different color value. And so one of the hardest things to do, especially in these opaque plastics, is get the coloring right And one of the hardest things to do on these liquid plastics is to get the coloring right for them. So typically I tend to do either a flat base color and then plan to paint them either with acrylics or with some other special effect medium like a gold leaf or spray paint or things like that, because it's hard enough to get a good base color mixed up with the sort of transition that happens between the liquid phase and the solid phase. And then this is our little medallion mold. So again, to demold this guy, I'm just going to kind of press slightly along the where our hot glue is to try and release it, get it to pop off of the bottom. And I get my mold of that guy. Now, if you have little flashing issues like this, where there was just a little bit that worked its way underneath before that hot glue stopped it, you can either carefully use an X-Acto blade, or I use these like cuticle trimmer things to just very gently right around the edge. To clean up that mold. And there you can see a very quick and fast way to make a bunch of coin molds or medallions or replicate buttons or all sorts of things. Let's see, there's our opaque blue coin. There is one additional treatment that I use a lot in this liquid plastic casting world, and that's what's called cold casting. What cold casting is this is the application of typically a metallic powder. So for example, this is a pewter colored powder. And by applying that to the surface of the mold and then backing it in resin, you get the look of a metallic object without having to actually cast it in metal. This is a example that I made for a show of some pine cones that we did with a sort of coppery powder. And you can see on the bottom, they were just backfilled in black. But by having that metallic powder sitting on the surface when the resin cured, it caught all that powder and allowed it to keep a sort of shiny surface. This is that same color powder used for a lion head mold that we use for Midsummer Night Dream. Instead of using an opaque, I use a clear for this one, just to make sure that if I needed any translucency to go through, it would. But again, sort of the same surface texture and treatment by applying that metallic powder to the mold itself and then curing resin on the back side of it. So, we're going to make a little pewter coin. I like to use these really inexpensive brushes to kind of brush the powder in, to kind of keep things from going too much all over the place, although it still will. And what I'm trying to achieve here is to create just a single level of the powder on the surface. Because if I have any more than a single level of powder on the surface, it won't bond, I might lose some detail, and I might end up with some holes or some other air spots, which is not what I'm after, which will give me a better finished casting. Now that I'm happy with the coverage, I'm going to go knock this out over the trash can to get rid of all the extra. So now that I've got all of that burnished out, I'm going to go ahead and backfill it. Now typically, historically, If you're going to backfill gold leaf, you use red. If you're going to backfill silver leaf, you use blue. And then if you're going to backfill copper or bronze or things like that, you tend to use black. With this pewter, because I want to kind of tone it down a little bit, I think I'm going to use the black. So again, the same way that we've been showing this whole class, I'm just going to mix up a 1-to-1 by volume of our smooth cast 30-Q, the fast setting stuff, and add a little bit of black pigment to it and be right back. So again, as this is our opaque plastic, even though this looks really dark and gray in this cup right now, when it cures, it'll be a much lighter sort of light gray color. Again, this is really important when you are pouring into something with a powder. You want to kind of find one spot to start with and let it really flow out, because otherwise you can damage the surface by pulling off too much of the powder. And then once it kind of is flooded, then you can kind of go back in and fill up. You have to be careful too when you're working around other projects that are currently casting, because you can see I've gotten some of the pewter on the back of this guy. But these guys still are not quite ready to pull out, but I'm going to go ahead and pull them out to show you. So see, that is our little blue coin medallion guy. And you can see how this is now curing in that sort of lighter gray color. There's our clear blue coin. Again, same pigment for both of these coins. Just two different products that they went into. And then one of the most fascinating things that I always love with this stuff, because this is basically a dye, is that the bigger the piece, the darker it is. So you can see how this finial seems to be a lot darker than our coin, even though they're the exact same tone, just because their thicknesses are so different. And because of that, the light refracts through them differently, and so you get a very different treatment color. Even though you can see here on the flanges, it is the exact same thing. It seems so much darker because the volume is more concentrated, and so it's not nearly as translucent. So see, there's our pewter coin. I use it a lot to make fake pewter stuff. We made pewter goblets when we did Crucible, pewter bowls and plates and things like that, so they can be on stage and safe and sort of indestructible plastic, but they have all the look of pewter pieces. So now that you guys know how to basically build a standard mold and pour a standard casting in it, I want to kind of end today's class by talking about some other sort of fancier things that you can do with them. One of the other things that I like to do a lot with this product is I like to swirl my colors together. This is a lion head that I did kind of just as a demo to show you guys what can be achieved. This is with two opaques. So the opaque white and then tinted into that darker red color and then mixing them together to make a third sort of medium pink color. And the reasons that I really like to swirl things, especially if I'm doing either statuary things or fake food items, I personally do not think that solid flat colors are the most convincing on stage, and so I always like to give my props a little bit of a variety, because I think that no matter what, they seem more realistic that way. And this is a really good way of doing that. Because by pouring one single thing, I've got that sort of variety already pre-built into my look. Now, there are a couple of unique and different things that you need to think about when you're doing that. So for this example today, I'm going to use our clears so that we kind of get our same sense of what we've been working on previously. And I'm going to use our blue that you guys have already seen, as well as an orange. And what I have to do when I'm doing a sort of multicolor mix pour is I have to mix up each part individually. That way I'm assured that each one is chemically mixed all the way through, and I don't have any parts that are unmixed and might become problematic. Now, the slightly weird thing about this is that you want to mix your smallest parts first. As we've been talking about, this is an exothermic reaction. So if I were to mix the biggest one first, it would actually go off first. And so instead, I need to mix the smaller ones to try and give myself enough working time to be able to get this swirl together in the way that I'm looking for. Again, I'm going to try and flood the front surface of this just to try and get sort of the base layer of clear in each of these. But I do want to make sure I reserve some clear because I can use the clear to spread it out if anything gets too weird in when I'm adding my colorant in. And I do like to kind of swirl around just to kind of make sure that everything's kind of wet. I find that it kind of helps. You're trying to not get the colors to actually touch too much. And then I like with either a bamboo skewer or a toothpick or really thin like popsicle skewer, coffee stirrer, to then come back through and kind of adds our texture into these. So now's where I can kind of swirl ever so slightly along those edges to give me the movement I'm after, but to try and not get too much mixing together. And you can see how this is already starting to gel up, so I'm already basically out of time. But if I do have any weird parts like this one where it's got a little dark, I can very much at the last minute kind of pour some more clear just to try and spread out that a little bit. But you can see how thick this clear has already gotten. So even though these aren't quite finished being cured yet, I wanted to kind of end out the class by showing you what you can kind of achieve. So that's our little cameo mold. And there's our coin tie-dye look. Even cooler when holding it up to the light. Anyway, I hope you guys learned some fun things about making molds and playing with liquid plastics. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I hope you guys enjoyed conference and have a great rest of your conference. See you guys soon. Bye.